When I'm impressed me as a brigade general, and just pass these around when we get that started now.
Where you might know, Mark?
Mr. Tom Pegram III was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and grew up in Ripley over on Jackson Street. Y'all know where all those big houses are, old houses. Graduated from Ripley High School, lifelong student of the Civil War, and maintains a large personal Civil War library. He's a graduate of the University of Mississippi and the Mississippi College School of Law. He is a retired special agent of the FAI and an attorney. Tom and his wife, Martha, live in Memphis, where they recently celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. Just to go one step further, he is a member of our camp, wanted to join our camp. And y'all might remember when Mr. Pegram spoke to us before at the church, it's our common practice to buy the speaker and their guest a meal. Well, he wouldn't have any part of that last time on tonight. He didn't want us to buy it. He wanted to pay it himself. That just speaks highly of the caliber of his personality and man. So without further ado, this is our camp member, Tom Pegram.
Thank you, Mark. I want all of you to know that it's just a real pleasure for me to be here tonight. The last time I was here, you will remember I talked about the Confederate service of my ancestors from this area, including Major William G. Pegram from Benton County, who was with the 34th Mississippi Infantry Regiment, Grant. And tonight, I want to talk about my ancestors from Virginia who fought with the Confederacy, namely three brothers, Major James West Pegram Jr., Colonel William R.J. Pegram, known as Willie in the family, and Brigadier General John Pegram. John fought in the Western Theater here, and he led a division under Nathan Bedford Forrest at Chickamauga. But the brothers, James West, William, and John, were my third cousins, thrice removed. They were the seventh generation of the Pegram family in America. I am the 10th generation. And our common ancestor was their great-great-grandfather, Edward Pegram, who was my 5th great-grandfather. But before I talk about the brothers, I want to give you a little background about them and their family. Their father, General James West Pegram, was born in Dinwiddie County, Virginia in 1804. He married Virginia Johnson, and they had 5 children. He was a brigadier general in the Virginia militia, and he was an attorney, a lawyer in Petersburg, Virginia, and in Richmond, Virginia, and he ultimately became president of the Bank of Virginia in Richmond. But as I say, General James West in Virginia had five children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. And in 1844, James West purchased a large cotton operation here in Mississippi. I don't know where it was located, but he started on a trip south in order to complete that transaction. And he was on a steamboat, the Lucy Walker, out on the Ohio River, and that boat stalled out in the middle of the river. There was an explosion in the boat's boiler room, and about 50 people were killed, including James West Pegram. But he died a hero's death. He saved a woman and her daughter that he didn't even know, and his body was never found. But the one brother who survived the war was Major James West Pegram Jr. And the Charleston, South Carolina News and Courier newspaper carried James West's obituary, and it called him a good and a brave soldier. And it also had some comments in there about the Pegram family, and I want to quote that to you from this Charleston newspaper. Few Pegrams in the South, few families in the South suffered more than that to which James West Jr. belonged. The two sons of his uncle, Captain Robert B. Pegram, were in the Confederate service, as were his two brothers. And there were 5 sons of Captain Pegram's 2 sisters. Of these 10, as brave young men as ever wore the grave, 5 were killed in action. And 1 was severely wounded that amputation of his leg was necessary. And among the slain were James West's brothers, General John and Colonel William J. The oldest brother, John, graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at a time when Robert E. Lee was the superintendent of the academy. Jeb Stewart and Robert E. Lee's son, Custis Lee, as well as Stephen D. Lee, who you all know, were his classmates. So he was in pretty good company. But in May of 1861, John Pegram resigned his commission from the United States Army. And in June 1861, he began his service to the Confederacy. He was a lieutenant colonel in the 20th Virginia Infantry Regiment, and he fought in the unsuccessful campaign in Western Virginia, and he was captured at Rich Mountain. After he was exchanged, John served with the Army of Tennessee from April of 1862 until October of 1863. And in April 1862, John was promoted to the temporary rank of full colonel, and he was ordered to report to General Beauregard in Mississippi. Now, in May of 1862, he was chief of engineers for General Beauregard at Corinth, where the Army had withdrawn after Shiloh. Beauregard, as you all know, evacuated Corinth, and on June 8th, the Army was at Tupelo. General Bragg replaced Beauregard, and Bragg retained John Pegram as his chief of engineers. But in August of 1862, John Pegram was detached from Bragg and ordered to report to General Edmund Kirby Smith as Kirby Smith's chief of staff. And he served in that capacity throughout the Kentucky campaign, and at the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, General Smith gratefully acknowledged John Pegram's services. But in November of 1862, John was promoted to Brigadier General, and he was transferred to the command of General Joseph Wheeler in the Army of Tennessee, and he had a brigade. And he fought at the Battle of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and later on he had various outposts up in Middle Tennessee and assignments up in East Tennessee. And in the spring of 1863, he was assigned part of the Department of East Tennessee, and after that he fought with General Daniel Smith Donaldson under his command. And on March 22nd, the commander in the West, Joseph E. Johnson, ordered John to conduct a raid into Kentucky. That it was not a successful raid. But on September 3rd of 1863, John was given a cavalry brigade, and he was ordered to report to General Nathan Bedford Forrest in the Army of Tennessee. And in that very same order, General Forrest was placed in command of all of the cavalry north of Chattanooga. At the Battle of Chickamauga, John Pegram's cavalry, was involved in the opening of the battle. And it was here that he led a division under General Forrest. On September 19th of 1863, the Battle of Chickamauga began at a time and a place that was not expected by the commanding general of either army. Forrest had the responsibility of protecting the army's right flank. And about daylight that morning, he went out to reconnoiter in the area near what was known as Reed's Bridge. And about 7:30 that morning, opening shots of the battle were fired when John's cavalry became engaged with Union infantry. And this was in the deep, deep woods near what was known as Jay's Sawmill. Well, John's troops were not yet in line of battle, and Forrest, hearing the firing, hurried over to help him get them lined in battle, and they got the troops well posted. And as soon as the fighting began, General Forrest sent back for reinforcements, infantry reinforcements. John Pegram's troops dismounted, and they began to fight infantry style. And their lines were so regular that the opposing Union army thought that they were fighting regular infantry. But when Forrest's messages for help failed to get the help, Forrest himself, he went for them himself. And he left John Pegram in command. And he told John, "You must hold what you have here, no matter what may happen, until I can go for the infantry and until I can arrive back." Now, Forrest's biographer, John Allen White, writes about this in his book, That Devil Forrest. And I want to quote you from that book. Pegram promised to do it, and did it well, though at a terrific cost. From behind trees and logs and every possible point of vantage, these cavalrymen on foot fought with a stubbornness and a precision of infantry. They held on like grim death, and grim death held on to many of them. 1/4 of their number went down then and there. Forrest hurried back, and he brought foot soldiers with him. Pegram says it became apparent that we were fighting overpowering numbers. General Forrest, having sent several messages for help, finally went for him himself, ordering me to hold the position until they arrived back. And in obeying that order, we lost about 1/4 of our command. And about this time, Forrest was everywhere, reassuring the men that help was on the way. He would go by the infantry units, he'd say, "Hold on," shout, "Hold on, boys, help's on the way. They'll soon be here to relieve you." He went by the artillery battery. "Stay by your guns, men. Support the battery. General Walker's troops will be here in 5 minutes to help you out." And sure enough, about 9 o'clock, Colonel Claudius Wilson's infantry brigade of Walker's Corps arrived on the scene, and they were rushed to the front. And about an hour later, General Matthew Ector's brigade of the same corps arrived, Walker's Corps. They were hurried to the front. Debrell's cavalry brigade of Armstrong's division arrived. They were hurried to the front, and they dismounted and began to fight like infantry, like John's troops. Well, Forrest at this time became deeply involved in combat at the artillery unit. And he was wearing a long linen duster with his pistol and his sword belted around it. And he was down among the artillery, the guns blasting away, the men fighting like mad. And he was exposing himself to heavy infantry and artillery fire. But Forrest at this time was masterful. Few generals could inspire frontline troops and maintain a perspective on the larger tactical scale like Forrest could. And that's what he did here. And the battle raged furiously all along the front. And finally, the Confederate cavalry and infantry were driven back to the starting point near Jay's sawmill. But reinforcements continued to arrive on both sides, and what had started out as a skirmish became a battle, the Great Battle of Chickamauga. And once the Confederate lines were adequately reinforced, John Pegram's part in the battle just about ended. After that, it was up to the artillery and to the infantry. But the fighting on September 19th seesawed back and forth. Attack, counterattack, attack, counterattack. And at the end of the day, the battle was indecisive. But the battle resumed the next day, and about 1/3 of the Union Army, including their commander, General William Rosecrans, was driven from the field. The Federal Army was only saved from total destruction by a gallant rearguard action on the part of General George Thomas at Horseshoe Ridge. As you all know, Chickamauga was a Confederate victory. Well, after Chickamauga, John Pegram returned to the Army of Northern Virginia. And for the rest of his short life, he fought with General Robert E. Lee on his native soil in Virginia. He was given an infantry brigade made up of Virginia regiments. And in May of 1864, at the Battle of the Wilderness, on the second day of battle, Confederate troops made gallant stands in repulsing Union attacks. And it was here that John Pegram and his brigade distinguished themselves. It was also here that John was severely wounded in the leg. He couldn't return to battle until the fall of 1864. And then he won laurels in fighting General Phil Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, where he led a division. John remained a brigadier general, although he exercised all of the duties and all of the responsibilities of a major general. And in the winter of 1865, he led a division under General John B. Gordon. But on February 6, 1865, at Hatcher's Run, Virginia, John Pegram's troops clashed with a heavy Union force. And it was here that they were driven back. They withdrew. But they became reinforced, they reformed, they counterattacked, and with John leading his troops, John was mortally wounded. This was 2 months, just 2 months before Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The newspapers and comments about John, I'd like to give you a little about that. The Richmond Whig newspaper said, quote, though unsuccessful early in the war, General Pegram had latterly established an enviable reputation as a gallant soldier and an able and efficient officer. John Pegram's commander, General John B. Gordon, said, quote, in one of General Grant's efforts to break through my line, General John Pegram, one of my most accomplished commanders, fell, his blood reddening the white snow that covered the field. John was dead at the age of 33. Now, I've talked about John's military service. I want to tell you a little about his personal life, and particularly about his marriage to the fascinating Hetty Carey. I think you'll find this interesting. When Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as President of the United States, Hetty Carey was, the future Mrs. John Pegram, was in her 20s and was living in Baltimore, Maryland. Many said that Hetty Carey was the most beautiful woman of her day and generation. And in April of 1861, Union troops were marching through Baltimore on their way to Washington, D.C., and they were attacked by an angry mob, and men were killed on both sides. After that, Baltimore became treated as a secessionist city. But Hetty Carey was an avid Southern sympathizer. One day, Union troops were marching through the streets of Baltimore. They went by Hetty's house, and she grabbed a smuggled Confederate flag and waved it in defiance out her window at these troops. And a Union soldier asked his commander, shall I arrest her now? The answer was, no. She is beautiful enough to do as she pleases. And they didn't arrest her. And after that, Hetty would smuggle medicines, food, supplies, all type of items to the Confederate soldiers that were fighting in Virginia. But finally, it became apparent that she was going to be arrested. So Hetty and her cousin, her younger sister, Jenny, fled Maryland. They went to Virginia, and they reached Richmond, where they lived with their cousin, Constance Carey. But at the Battle of First Manassas, due to the similarity of the Confederate flag and the Union flag, there were times when it was difficult to determine the identity of the troops. General Beauregard resolved this by having a new Confederate battle flag designed. The Carey girls each made a flag that was a prototype of the Confederate flag, Confederate battle flag, that was used throughout the war. And I'm talking about the prototype, this very flag that's here under this podium. And each girl presented her flag to a Confederate general. Hetty to General Beauregard, Connie to General Beauregard, Hetty to General Johnson, and Jenny to Earl Van Dorn. Hetty was somewhat at the center of whatever social life there could be in a starving and war-torn Richmond, Virginia. And it was here that she became engaged to marry General John Pegram. And this was in 1862. Now, they were not able to get married until 1865, when John's troops were stationed near Petersburg, Virginia. But they did get, on January 19th, 1865, at St. Paul's Church in Richmond, Hetty and John were married. The church was packed. President and Mrs. Jefferson Davis and other dignitaries were in attendance at the wedding. Also in attendance, it was said, were bad signs or ill omens. Varina Davis requested Jefferson Davis to send the president's carriage and horses to pick up Hetty and bring her to the church. Well, when the carriage arrived, the horses became unruly, and it was obvious if she went in that carriage, there's going to be a smash-up. So they got another carriage. She ended up going in what I'd call a dilapidated buggy. But this delayed all of the ceremonies. But finally she arrived, and as she started in the church, she dropped her handkerchief. She reached down to pick it up. She tore her dress. She tore her wedding veil. But nevertheless, she got down the aisle, and a day before that, she had broken a mirror that was on her dress. So all of the superstitious in the audience said that these were bad signs and ill omens. But nevertheless, they were married that day in St. Paul's. Hetty was a beautiful bride, and she and John, as I say, were married. Well, not long after that, on February 2nd, 1865, John's adjutant arranged it so that an already scheduled review of John's troops would be turned into a tribute to Hetty, to the new bride. Now, Hetty was present at the review, but also present were Generals Robert E. Lee, Longstreet, Hill, Gordon, Heath, Anderson, and others to meet the new bride. And as John started by in the review with his troops, General John Gordon allowed Hetty with General Robert E. Lee standing at her side to review the troops and the other generals nearby. What an honor. For a brief time, military pageantry suppressed the horror of all the war that was going on. After this honor, Hetty was riding back through her husband's camp, and her horse struck a Confederate soldier and nearly knocked him down. Well, Hetty reined in her horse, and she was terribly embarrassed, and she began to apologize, and the soldier very gallantly stepped back. He took off his hat, and he looked up at her, and he says, "Never mind, miss. You might have read all over me." Four days later, John Pegram was killed in a counterattack at Hatcher's Run. A Federal sharpshooter's bullet hit him in the chest near the heart. But the funeral services for John Pegram were held in St. Paul's Church, the same church where he and Hetty had been married just 3 weeks earlier. His coffin stood on the spot where they had been married. The same preacher that married them conducted John's funeral service. And those in attendance at the funeral were the same that attended the wedding. Many said, and many remembered, the ill omens that had taken place preceding the wedding. John was buried in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. On the same day that John died, General Robert E. Lee was placed in command of all of the armies of the Confederacy. And when General Lee learned of John's death, his heart was heavy. both he and Mrs. Lee sent a note of sympathy to John, or to Hetty. Condolences and sympathy. General Lee's note, and I want to quote you from that, said, quote, I cannot find words to express my deep sympathy in your affliction, my sorrow in your loss. Hetty had been John's fiancée for nearly 3 years, his bride for almost 3 weeks, and now she was a widow. In conclusion, I want to tell you about my favorite of the brothers, the youngest brother, Colonel William J. Pegram, known in the family as Willie, and sometimes called the Confederate boy colonel of artillery. Willie served in the Confederate Army from April of 1861 until April of 1865, and he rose through the ranks from private to become a full colonel of artillery at the young age of 23. In physical appearance, you would think Willie Pegram to be suited for anything but Army life. He was small, he had a beardless boy's face, and he was so nearsighted that he had to wear thick lens glasses, or specs as they called them. Well, this was an obvious handicap to anyone who was a gunner, like Willie was. But Willie's friend, John Haskell, who was also a brilliant gunner, had this to say about Willie's so-called handicap. And I quote John Haskell, "The better I knew him, the greater my wonder was to see how he could overcome his natural defects. But he did. And altogether because he had a character and a will that were grand, a sense of duty never surpassed, and a determination to do his best, utterly regardless of his own safety or comfort." General Henry Heath once said that Pegram was one of a few men I knew who was extremely, extremely happy when he was in battle. They said that when he'd get in battle, his face would just light up. It just glowed. And he'd come galloping up the road with his artillery behind him, and you'd hear a soldier shout, "There's going to be a fight. Here comes that damn little man with a specs." Well, Willie was known throughout the Army for his eagerness to engage the enemy in battle, and his utter contempt for the enemy when he was in battle. He combined this fondness of battle with his gift of a natural leader, and it was said that Willie Pegram was born to command. On April 17, 1861, Virginia seceded. The very next day, a 19-year-old Willie Pegram joined Company F, a military unit that had been called into service by the governor. He later became drilling instructor, or was appointed drill instructor of the Purcell Artillery Battery. That famous battery fought with Willie under General A.P. Hill in Hill's Light Division or 3rd Corps, wherever they fought, including Cedar Mountain, Antietam, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Petersburg, wherever they fought. And it was said that Willie Pegram's name was synonymous with action in the Army of Northern Virginia. Excuse me. His adjutant, one of Willie's adjutants, said that Pegram's history is the history of the Army with which he fought. And General Robert E. Lee said, after the war, quote, "No one in the Army had a higher opinion of his gallantry and worth than myself. They were conspicuous on every field." On March 31st of 1862, Willie Pegram was promoted to full colonel to captain. And he was given command of the Purcell Artillery Battery. He continued to be promoted, and in February of 1864, he was in command of Pegram's artillery battalion, consisting of 5 batteries, including his old Purcell battery. Willie was said by many to be the best gunner in Lee's army. His men were absolutely devoted to him. He had all the qualities and traits of a leader. He was calm. He never got excited. He was a strict disciplinarian, but he was always thoughtful of his men. And like I said a minute ago about General Forrest, he led by example. You'd find Willie down among the guns, cheering his men on, helping to fire the guns. And he always moved his guns up to the hottest part of the battle. From private up to Robert E. Lee, Willie Pegram was the pride of the Army. A private who served in Willie's guns once talked about the way he fought. It's a good description. I'd like to quote this to you. As commander of an artillery battalion, he built up a reputation second to none for the effective handling of his guns. His favorite method, where practicable, being a rush to close quarters with the enemy and to open at the shortest possible range. Willie's adjutant said that other than Jeb Stuart, Willie Pegram had been under fire more than any man in the Army. His men said that the bullet hadn't been molded that could kill him. A.P. Hill called him my gallant captain of artillery. And General Charles Field probably gave him the highest compliment when he said that whenever I was going into battle, I always requested Colonel Pegram's artillery battalion to be the one that accompanied me. On the death of General James J. Archer, 2 division commanders, Henry Heath and Richard Anderson, recommended that a 23-year-old Willie Pegram be promoted to Brigadier General and given Archer's infantry brigade. General A.P. Hill endorsed Heath's recommendation, and he said, I quote General Hill, "No officer in the Army of Northern Virginia has done more to deserve this promotion than Lieutenant Colonel Pegram." Willie did not get the promotion. And here's what Robert E. Lee said, and I'm quoting General Lee. "He is too young." How old is Colonel Pegram? Heath replied, "I don't know, but I suppose he's about 25. Well, he was 23. General Lee said, "I think a man of 25 is as good as he will ever be. What he acquires after that is from experience. But I can't understand when an officer is doing excellent service, why he would want to change." The recommendation for the promotion was returned, and it was marked that Willie was too valuable to the artillery for them to lose him. However, on April 18, 1865, Willie Pegram was promoted to full colonel of artillery at the young age of 23. On April 1st, 1865, 8 days, just 8 days before Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and less than 2 months after his older brother had been killed, Willie Pegram was killed at the Battle of Five Forks in Virginia. That battle has been called the Waterloo of the Confederacy. Willie once said, "Men, if the enemy takes a gun from my battery, look for my dead body in front of him." Finally, one of his guns was taken, and his dead body lay beside it, his mortally wounded body. Willie's last command was, "Fire your canister low." One of his officers described Willie Pegram as the truest Christian, the most faithful friend, and the most superb soldier in all the world. In the fading echo of the guns, the brothers now rested in peace together. It's been my genuine pleasure to be here with you, and I thank you.